The fence post snapped under her hammer on the same morning that everything else in Belle Dalton's life came apart. She stood there with splinters across her palms and sawdust on her cheek, staring at the gap in the line she had spent 3 weeks building alone, and the sound of hooves on the packed dirt road pulled her head up sharp. Another rider. Another man on a horse who would look straight ahead, pretend the fence did not exist, pretend she did not exist, and keep on riding toward whatever mattered more than a woman doing something hard in the middle of a land that had already taken everything from her. She knew what they thought. She had heard it through the thin walls of the general store in Caldwell, Kansas, in the summer of 1879. A widow trying to hold a homestead claim was a tragedy waiting to finalize itself. A widow who actually put up her own fence was something stranger than that, something they did not have the language for, so they chose silence instead. The rider came level with her property line, and Belle straightened her spine the way her mother had taught her, the way that costs nothing and surrenders nothing. She recognized the dark bay gelding before she recognized the man. It was the sheriff's horse. It was Amos Keating's horse. And unlike every other man who had passed this fence in the last 3 weeks without so much as a tipped hat or a slowed pace, he stopped. He actually stopped. His eyes moved along the length of her fence line with the slow, deliberate attention of a man who understood what he was looking at, post to post, rail to rail. The corners braced properly with angled supports. The gate she had fitted herself with salvaged iron hardware. He sat very still in the saddle for a moment that stretched so long Belle felt her chest tighten, with something she did not yet have a name for. Then he looked directly at her, and the afternoon light caught the lines of his face, and he said 4 words in a voice that was low and unhurried and absolutely serious. "You have done fine work." That was all. He touched the brim of his hat, urged the bay forward, and was gone around the bend in the road before Belle realized she had stopped breathing. She did not know why those 4 words hit her like a physical thing. She had been strong for so long. She had buried a husband and kept a claim and driven off a coyote with nothing but a lantern and a fury born from desperation. She had hauled fence posts in a borrowed wagon and dug holes in ground that had the consistency of old iron. She had done every single piece of it without a single acknowledgement from any human being who passed by, and she had told herself she did not need one. She had built the walls on the inside just as carefully as the ones out here in the Kansas wind. And then one quiet sheriff said 4 words, and something behind her ribs went dangerously loose. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth, looked at the broken post, and then she did something she had not done in 2 years of widowhood. She sat down on the dry grass and let herself feel the full weight of it. That was where the story truly began. 3 weeks earlier, Belle Dalton had arrived at the land office in Caldwell on a Tuesday in late June, with a deed that had her late husband Clarence's name on it, and a letter from the county clerk, acknowledging that the claim transferred to her upon his death. She was 27 years old, 5 feet and 4 inches of controlled composure in a dress that had been let out twice and taken in once, with dark hair, and eyes the color of creek water under shadow. And she had a plan that she had worked out on paper during the long wagon ride from her sister's house in Wichita. She would hold the claim. She would improve the property. She would fence the boundary because fencing was both protection and proof of intent, and the homestead law required visible improvement or the land reverted. She had one growing season to show enough to satisfy the county. She had the lumber allotment from the local mill that Clarence had arranged before the fever took him in April. She had seeds and a small amount of money and a stubbornness that had outlasted 2 winters, 1 flood, and a marriage that had been many things but had not always been tender. Clarence Dalton had not been cruel. He had been distant in the way that men became distant when the land failed them repeatedly, and the dream of it did not. He had been 38 when they married, and Belle had been 22, and the age between them had felt larger with each passing year. He had brought her west because he believed in Kansas, and then Kansas had taken most of what he believed in, and at the end there had been little between them except habit and a shared exhaustion. She had grieved him properly. She grieved the possibility of him more than the reality. She grieved the version of their life that had never quite arrived. Then she had looked at the land deed and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that this might be the first thing that was entirely hers. The man at the land office, a bored and sun-yellowed clerk named Patterson, had looked at her paperwork with the expression of someone handling a legal puzzle he found mildly irritating. He had verified everything 3 times. He had asked whether she had family who might take on the claim. She had said no, which was not entirely true, but was true enough for his purposes. He had finally stamped the transfer and sent her out with a receipt and a look that suggested he expected to see her back within the month, defeated. She had gone to the mill next and arranged for her lumber to be delivered. The mill owner, a heavy-set man named Gruber, had been polite enough, but he had also suggested, very gently, that she might want to hire someone for the fence work. He knew a man. The man would do it for a fair price. Belle had looked at the price the man would charge and looked at the money she had and done the arithmetic that required no paper. She had thanked Gruber and arranged to pick up the lumber herself in 2 loads. She had not expected it to be easy. She had not expected the posts to be lighter than they were, or the ground to be softer, or the sun to be less insistent. She had not expected any mercy from the physical work itself. What she had not expected was the silence. The road that ran along the south edge of her property was the main track between Caldwell and the smaller ranches and farms to the west. A dozen men rode it every day. Ranchers, farmhands, the delivery driver from the dry goods store, the doctor's hired man, riders from the cattle operations up toward the Oklahoma Territory border. She had seen faces she recognized and faces she did not. Every single one of them had looked straight ahead and passed without a word. She understood some of it. A woman alone doing fence work was awkward for them. In a way, they did not know how to navigate. Stopping to help implied she needed help, which implied she could not manage, which was a complicated courtesy to offer. Not stopping felt safer. Silence felt easier. She understood it, and she resented it with a quiet, burning energy that she turned directly into the work. Every post she drove into the ground was an answer to that silence. Every rail she seated into the notch was a sentence in a language she was writing for herself. By the end of the 2nd week, she had half the fence up and a blister on each palm that had progressed through its own complete arc of suffering, and was now a kind of numb toughness she had made her peace with. She had also had her first real interaction with Amos Keating, though she had not known his name yet, and it had not been pleasant. She had been in the Caldwell General Store on a Thursday afternoon, buying flour and lamp oil and a spool of wire for the fence gate, when a dispute broke out near the back of the store between 2 men who had been drinking since mid-morning by the smell of them. She had moved toward the door with her purchases, wanting nothing to do with it, when the louder of the 2 men stumbled backward and knocked into her, sending the spool of wire bouncing across the floorboards and the flour bag dropping hard enough to split at the seam. She had stood there with flour on her skirt and fury on her face, and a man had come through the store door in the same moment. He was tall, spare in the way of men who worked outdoors, with a sheriff's badge on a dark coat and a manner about him that changed the air in the room. He had looked at the 2 drunk men. He had looked at Belle and the mess on the floor. He had looked at the store owner. "I will need both of you to step outside," he had said to the drunk men in a tone that was completely without theater. Just a fact, just a direction. They had gone. He had sent them out like weather passing through, and then he had turned back to the interior of the store and his eyes had landed on Belle, still standing in her ruined flour with an expression she could not entirely school into neutrality. "Are you hurt?" he had asked. "No," she had said. "I am only angry." Something in his expression had shifted, not into amusement exactly, but into a recognition of something. He had reached down and picked up the spool of wire and set it on the counter near her. Then he had spoken to the store owner about replacing her flour, which the owner had done with a speed that suggested the sheriff carried a particular kind of authority in this town. He had not made a production of it. He had simply stated what was reasonable, and it had happened. Belle had said thank you, and he had nodded, and that had been the sum total of it. She had not known his name until she asked Patterson at the land office the following morning, describing the tall sheriff with the dark coat and the unhurried way of resolving things. Patterson had said, without looking up from his ledger, that would be Amos Keating. Been sheriff here going on 4 years. Came from Missouri. Keeps to himself. Keeps to himself. That tracked, Belle had thought. He had managed to help her in the store while communicating almost nothing personal about himself at all. It was efficient, and it was also, in its way, deeply impersonal. She had filed the name away and gone back to her fence. And then he had stopped on the road and said she had done fine work, and she was now sitting in the dry summer grass feeling things she had not given herself permission to feel in a very long time. She got up. She fixed the broken post. She finished the section before sunset. 2 days later, he stopped again. She was on her knees at the gate, working the iron hinge into alignment, when the bay horse's shadow fell across her. She looked up, squinting against the late morning light, and Amos Keating was looking down at her from the saddle with an expression that was careful and attentive. "You are having trouble with the hinge," he said. It was not a question. "I am solving a problem with the hinge," she said. "There is a difference." He was quiet for a moment. Then, without asking, he swung down from the saddle and tied the bay to the fence post she had just secured. He crouched down beside her and looked at the hinge assembly with the same deliberate attention he had given the fence line 2 days ago. "The upper bolt is set too shallow," he said. "We'll hold for a week and then pull free when the gate weight settles." Belle looked at the bolt. He was right. She could see it now that he named it. "I do not have a longer bolt," she said. "I do," he said. He went to the saddlebag on his horse and came back with a tin of miscellaneous hardware that clinked with that particular music of useful things accumulated over time. He found a bolt of the right length and a washer and held them out to her. She took them. She did the work herself. He watched without interfering, handing her the wrench when she reached for it, holding the gate steady when she needed both hands. They worked together in a silence that was completely different from the silence of all the riders who had passed without comment. This silence had texture. It had a tension in it. When the gate swung true on its new hardware, she stood up and dusted her hands on her work apron. "Thank you," she said. "You would have figured it out," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "But this is faster." He almost smiled. She saw it move across his face like the shadow of a cloud there and gone. He untied the bay. He looked at her for a moment longer than courtesy required, and then he said, "Amos Keating, sheriff." "I know who you are," Belle said. "I am Belle Dalton. I own this land." "I know who you are," he said, in exactly her same inflection. Then he rode away, and this time she watched him go. The thing she noticed, that she turned over in her mind that evening while she cooked a simple supper of beans and cornbread on the iron stove in the small farmhouse, was that Amos Keating had not told her what she could or could not do. He had not suggested alternatives. He had not implied that the situation was unfortunate or impractical. He had looked at her work and called it fine, and then he had offered a longer bolt without making a story out of it. In a world that had spent the better part of 2 years telling her, through action and omission and careful avoidance, that her situation was remarkable and possibly foolhardy, this was a form of respect so simple it nearly undid her entirely. She did not let it. She was careful about that. She had learned to be careful. The fence was completed on the first day of July, and Belle stood at the end of it in the late afternoon and looked at the whole perimeter of her claim. Roughly 40 acres, bounded now by her own work. She had bent to the land, and the land had submitted to her intention, and the post stood straight and the rails were level, and the gate swung clean on its corrected hinge. It was not beautiful in any decorative sense. It was functional, and it was hers, and it was evidence. She was still standing there when Amos Keating rode past. He stopped, the way he had taken to stopping, and he looked at the completed fence with the same thoroughness he brought to everything. She watched him take in the work from end to end. He was quiet for longer than usual. Then he said, "Every rider who has passed this fence kept going without a word." She looked at him. She had not expected him to acknowledge that directly. The bluntness of it surprised her. "Yes," she said. "That was a failure of manners," he said. "And more than that." "More than that," she repeated. "You built something real," he said. "On your own, in difficult ground, that deserves to be named." The afternoon felt very still suddenly. A meadowlark called from somewhere down the fence line and fell silent. Belle felt something crack open in her chest, not painfully, but the way ground cracks before rain gets in, which is necessary for anything to grow. "You are the only one who said anything," she said. "Every rider passed without comment except you." "I noticed," he said. "It bothered me." "Why?" He looked at her for a long moment. The bay shifted under him, and he settled it with a slight pressure of his knee, still looking at her. "Because what you have done here is not easy or ordinary," he said. "And silence in the face of that is a kind of lie." She did not know what to say to that. She found she did not need to say anything. He nodded once, touched his hat, and rode on. But she noticed that he rode more slowly than usual, as if he was in less of a hurry to reach wherever he was going. That night she sat at her small table and wrote a letter to her sister Adeline in Wichita. She described the fence and the hard work and the successful completion. She described the land and the summer heat and the practical challenges of the coming growing season. She did not mention Amos Keating, but she wrote his name at the top of a blank page afterward, and then looked at it for a while before folding the page and setting it in the back of her Bible, where she kept things she was not ready to examine in full light. She was not a romantic fool. She knew better than to build a structure on 4 words and a longer bolt. She knew that lonely work made the mind susceptible to attaching significance to kindness, and that a sheriff who stopped at fences was not necessarily a man who stopped for anything more than courtesy. She had learned in her marriage to Clarence that the appearance of steadiness in a man did not always mean the real thing was there underneath, but she had also learned in the years since to trust the specific evidence of specific actions. Amos Keating had said true things quietly. He had done useful things without ceremony. He had not made her feel diminished or remarkable or unfortunate. He had simply looked at what she built and told the truth about it. That was not nothing. That was possibly the rarest thing she had encountered in years. On the second Saturday of July, Caldwell held its regular market morning at the edge of town, where farmers and ranchers and craftspeople laid out goods under canvas awnings, and the social machinery of the community ground through its weekly rotation. Belle went because she needed to sell the half-dozen jars of preserves she had put up from the small orchard at the back of the property, and because she needed information about the local seed merchant's fall availability, and because she was, in some way she acknowledged honestly to herself, lonely in a manner that required human proximity, even when it did not require human conversation. She set up her small table with the preserves and spent the first hour watching the flow of the market. She sold 2 jars of plum jam to a rancher's wife named Clara Hennessy, who was broad and warm-tempered, and who lingered to talk with a directness Belle found refreshing. Clara asked about the property, about her plans, about whether she had help lined up for harvest, and listened to the answers with genuine interest rather than the performance of interest that most people offered. "You are the one who built the fence yourself," Clara said. It was not a question either, but it landed differently than the same construction had in Amos Keating's mouth. Clara said it with a kind of impressed recognition. "I heard about that. Gruber at the mill mentioned it, said you refused to hire out." "I could not afford to hire out," Belle said. "Most people in your situation would have found a different claim," Clara said, "a smaller one, or gone back east." "I considered it," Belle admitted. "Then I did not." Clara looked at her with appraising eyes. "Amos Keating spoke well of your work, said the fence was solid. He does not say things like that lightly." Belle kept her face entirely still. "I would not know. I do not know him well." "No one does," Clara said, not unkindly. "He keeps things close, has since he came here. There was a story before he came to Caldwell, people say, though he has never told it directly. Something in Missouri that he does not speak of." She paused. "He is a good man, though. Caldwell has had sheriffs who were not, and the difference shows." Belle nodded. She sold another jar of preserves and spent the rest of the market morning turning Clara's words over slowly, like stones in a stream. A story in Missouri that he did not speak of. A dark past that had its own weight and shape, though she did not know its dimensions. She knew something about that. She knew what it was to carry things that did not translate easily into conversation. She was wrapping up her remaining jars in cloth for the wagon ride home when she heard his voice behind her and felt the particular quality of her own awareness change, the way a room changes when a door opens onto a source of light. "Mrs. Dalton," she turned. He was in his off-duty clothes, which meant a clean shirt and no badge, though he was not exactly the kind of man whose authority required a badge to be visible. He was carrying a wrapped parcel from one of the dry goods tables. "Sheriff Keating," she said. "Just Amos on a Saturday morning," he said. He looked at the remaining preserves. Plum, and one apple." "I will take the apple," he said. He produced the correct coin from his pocket with the ease of a man who paid fair prices without negotiation. She wrapped the jar and handed it over, and their fingers were very close to touching at the exchange, though they did not quite. "Do you have help lined up for your kitchen garden?" he asked. The question surprised her with its specificity. "I manage the garden myself." "I meant for turning the ground in the fall," he said. "The soil on that section of the county runs heavy. There is a layer of limestone underneath that changes the drainage. You will want to know where it runs before you decide where to put the permanent beds." She looked at him. "How do you know what my soil runs like?" "I have ridden every piece of land in this county," he said. "It is part of the work." She believed him. The answer was practical and completely true to the man she was beginning to understand him to be. He gathered information the way he gathered hardware in that tin, because useful things accumulated over time were worth having. "Would you be willing to tell me where the limestone runs?" she asked. She kept her voice level and made the question only what it was, a practical request. "I would be willing to show you," he said, "if you have time sometime in the next week." "I have time," she said. They agreed on Thursday afternoon. He touched the brim of his hat, tucked the jar of apple preserves under his arm, and walked away through the crowd. Belle watched him go and thought about the blank page in the back of her Bible with his name on it, and thought that she might need to unfold it after all. Thursday came with a sky like hammered silver, high clouds moving fast, the kind of light that makes the prairie look like it has intentions. Belle had her work apron off and her better dress on, which she told herself was practical because she might go into town afterward, and which she knew was not entirely about practicality at all. He arrived at the property gate at 3 in the afternoon exactly, on the bay horse, with his badge on today and a folded map in his saddlebag. He dismounted at the gate, and she came out to meet him, and they walked the property line together, with him reading the ground the way a physician reads a patient, with knowing attention to details that only made sense within a system he understood completely. He showed her where the limestone shelf ran, tracing it with a stick through the topsoil at intervals, explaining the drainage implications in clear language that assumed she had the intelligence to follow technical information, which she appreciated more than he could probably know. He showed her the low spot near the northeastern corner where water would collect, and which could either be a problem or an asset depending on how she managed it. He showed her a line of volunteer cottonwood seedlings along the western edge that could become a windbreak if she cultivated them rather than clearing them. She walked beside him and asked questions and got answers, and gradually became aware of something that had been building in the background of all their previous encounters. She was comfortable with this man in a way she had not been comfortable with any man in years. She did not feel performed at or managed. She did not feel that she was being accommodated or handled. She felt like she was being spoken to. At the eastern corner, they stopped because she had found something the previous week that she had not been able to identify. A seam of darker earth in a rough circle about 3 feet across where the grass grew differently. "What is this?" she asked. He looked at it for a moment. "There was a structure here before," he said. "A fire circle maybe, or a post hole arrangement for something temporary, old, before the homestead period." "Someone was here before me," she said. "Someone is always here before you," he said quietly. "That is the truth of this land. The Osage were through here, before them others. The land has a longer memory than any deed." She looked at him. He said it without guilt or defensiveness or politics, just as a fact, the way he said everything, just true things quietly. "Do you think that matters?" she asked. "For what I am doing here. I think it is worth knowing," he said. "Whether it matters is a question I cannot answer for you." They stood in the silence of that for a moment. The wind moved through the young cottonwoods. "Why did you come to Caldwell?" she asked. She had not meant to ask it yet, if ever. But it came out because the conversation had a particular texture that made directness feel possible. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. "I needed to start over somewhere," he said. "What happened in Missouri?" she asked, and then immediately, "You do not have to answer that." "Clara Hennessy told you there was a story," he said. "Not accusation, just accurate. She mentioned it." He looked at the dark circle in the earth for a moment. "I was a deputy sheriff in Springfield. I had a partner I trusted. We were working a case that involved a land fraud operation, the kind that used legal filings to strip homesteaders of their claims." He stopped. "My partner was part of it. He had been taking payments. When I found out, I gave him the opportunity to come forward himself. He chose instead to fabricate a record that made it appear I was the corrupt one." Belle went very still. "I was cleared," he said, "eventually, after an investigation that took 8 months, but the town had heard the accusation, and in a town an accusation lives longer than its correction. I had the truth and he had the head start on the story, and the story won the ground it needed to make staying impossible." He paused. "I came west. Caldwell offered me the position. I took it. Betrayal by a trusted partner. A hidden motive that had poisoned everything that came before it. A forced choice between staying and being destroyed, or leaving and starting from zero." Belle understood every element of that story from the inside out. "That is a considerable thing to carry," she said. "It taught me to trust carefully," he said. "It taught you to observe," she said. "That is why you notice things, the fence, the hinge bolt, the limestone." He looked at her then, a long look. "Yes," he said. "I understand carrying things you did not earn," she said, and she told him about Clarence. Not all of it, not the parts that were still too raw for sunlight, but the shape of it. The marriage that had never quite been what either of them needed. The years of diminishing hope and increasing silence. The grief that was complicated by its own ambivalence. The land that was now hers entirely for the first time in her life, something that was not inherited or assigned or given but held. He listened the way he did everything, with complete attention and no interruption. When she finished, the light had shifted to gold and the shadows were long across the property. "You built the fence," he said. "I built the fence," she agreed. Something passed between them in that moment. Not a declaration, not a touch, but a recognition so complete it functioned like both of those things. They looked at each other in the golden late afternoon light, with the full weight of their respective histories present and accounted for, and neither of them looked away. They walked back to the gate as the sun hit the tree line. He untied the bay. He stood with his hand on the saddle horn and looked at her. "Would you have dinner with me on Friday evening?" he asked. "There is a restaurant on the main street, Mrs. Cooper's. She does a proper meal." Belle considered the invitation and the man making it and everything she now knew about both. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." He rode away and she stood at her gate, her hand on the iron latch he had helped her set correctly, and she felt something she had almost forgotten the flavor of, something warm and frightening and forward-facing. Hope. Not the desperate, survival-adjacent kind she had been running on for 2 years, but the softer, more dangerous kind. the kind that means something might actually be good. She went inside and wrote a much longer letter to Adeline. Mrs. Cooper's restaurant was a clean, plain room with 6 tables covered in white oilcloth and a menu that was better than it needed to be for a town the size of Caldwell. Belle arrived 2 minutes before the time they had agreed on and found Amos already there, standing outside the door in a dark coat that was clearly his good one, hat in hand. He looked as if he had considered the occasion carefully, which moved her more than it perhaps should have. He held the door. They sat across from each other and ordered from the handwritten menu, and the conversation found its footing in approximately 30 seconds, which Belle recognized as remarkable. She had been at dinners in the company of men who required the full duration of a meal to produce 2 interesting sentences. Amos Keating was not that. He was precise and observant and occasionally dry in a way that made her laugh, actually laugh, with the sudden genuine quality of a laugh that has been waiting and then breaks free. She told him about Wichita and growing up in Ohio before that, and the particular texture of Midwestern girlhood, the distance between what was expected and what she had actually wanted. He listened and responded and did not redirect everything back to himself, which she noted. He told her about Missouri in the before time, before the betrayal. He had grown up in a farming family outside Springfield, the middle of 3 brothers. He had gone into law because he had a talent for reading situations and people, and because he believed in the specific value of order in communities that were still building themselves. He spoke about that belief with the same quiet conviction he brought to everything, as though he had thought it through to its roots and found it solid. "You still believe in it," she said, "after everything." "I believe in the idea," he said. "I'm more careful about the people." "That is wisdom earned the hard way," she said. "Most wisdom is," he said. They sat over their coffee long after the meal was finished, until Mrs. Cooper was cleaning around them with pointed diligence. They walked out into the summer night, and Caldwell's Main Street was lit by the lamps in the windows of the saloon and the boarding house, and the stars were enormous overhead the way they were in Kansas in summer, as if the sky had been scraped clean. He walked her to her wagon, which she had left at the livery at the end of the street. They stood beside it in the warm dark. She was very aware of him beside her, the particular quality of his presence, the steadiness of it. "I would like to do this again," he said. "So would I," she said. He took her hand, just that. He held it for a moment with a careful, deliberate warmth and then released it. She climbed up to the wagon seat, gathered the reins, and drove out of town under the enormous stars, feeling like something in her life had quietly turned in a direction she had not known she was moving toward. August arrived with heat so absolute it seemed to have physical weight, and the growing season made its demands on Belle without sentiment. She was up before dawn every day, working the kitchen garden in the cool of the morning and the practical work of the property in the slanting afternoon light when the worst of the heat had broken. She was stronger than she had been in the spring, not just physically, but in some foundational way. The fence she had built was a fact she returned to when she needed one. Amos came by the property twice a week, sometimes with specific reasons and sometimes with none stated, and the second category became the more common as August moved forward. He would tie the bay at the gate and walk to wherever she was working, and they would talk while she worked or sit on the small porch of the farmhouse in the cooler evenings with coffee or water, and the conversations went everywhere. They covered history and weather and the nature of justice in frontier communities, and the question of what constituted a fair price for labor, and the particular injustices embedded in the homestead system for people who lacked the capital to survive a bad year. She told him about the land fraud case he had worked in Missouri, and he made connections she found illuminating. The legal structures that enabled claim stripping were not gone, they had just moved. He had seen it in Kansas too, more subtle, operating through the courts and the land office in ways that affected especially the smaller and more isolated claimants. Women holding claims alone were among the most vulnerable, both to the formal mechanisms and to the informal pressure that could make holding on a matter of constant resistance. "Is my claim at risk?" she asked directly. "Not from any specific threat I know of," he said. "You have your documentation in order. You have visible improvement. You are inside the law's requirements." He paused. "There is a man named Fowler who operates a land consolidation business south of town. He has approached several small claimants about buying out. Some have sold. He is not illegal, but he is predatory about it." "Has he approached me?" "Not yet," Amos said. "He may. He knows your claim exists and that you are alone on it." Belle set her coffee cup down on the porch railing. "If he comes, I will tell him the same thing I told the land office and the mill owner and every other person who has implied I should find a less complicated situation." "No." Amos looked at her with something in his expression that was warm and certain. "I know," he said. "I am telling you so you are not surprised." "I appreciate that," she said. They were quiet in the good way that had become possible between them. The cicadas were loud in the August dark. The lamp inside the farmhouse threw a rectangle of yellow light through the window, and Belle was aware of how simple and complete this moment was, the porch and the coffee and this man beside her, and how unlike anything she had expected her life to produce at this particular point in it. "Amos," she said. "Yes. Tell me something you have not told anyone else in Caldwell." He was quiet for long enough that she thought she had asked too much. "Then, I am 41 years old, and I have spent most of those years being useful to other people, and very little of them building anything for myself. I came here with a badge and a horse and a tin of hardware, and I told myself that was sufficient." He paused. It was not insufficient, but it was not the same as enough. She looked at him in the dark. The lamp light caught the side of his face. "That changes," she said, "when you let it." "I know," he said, and the way he said it, looking at her, was unmistakable. She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the porch railing, and he turned his hand and held hers, and they sat like that while the cicadas wrote their long argument to the warm Kansas night. September brought the Fowler. Not the bird, the man. Elias Fowler arrived at Belle's gate on a Tuesday morning in his good suit on a dun horse, with a hired man behind him who wore the expression of someone paid to look imposing. Fowler himself was compact and smooth, with a land agent's practiced smile and eyes that did their real business while the smile was in operation. He introduced himself at the gate with elaborate courtesy. He had heard she was managing the claim alone and wanted to express his admiration, and also, purely as a practical matter, to inform her that he was in a position to make her a fair offer for the property should she ever find herself considering her options. "I'm not considering my options," Belle said, with her hand on the gate. "My option is this property. I'm exercising it." "Of course," Fowler said, still smiling. "Of course. I simply wanted you to know that a woman in your position has resources available to her. It can be a difficult thing, maintaining a claim alone. The winter here is unforgiving, and the second growing season is when most single-holder claims find their real challenges." "I appreciate the information about winter," Belle said. "I have made my preparations." "Have you truly?" he said, and the smile stayed but the tone shifted, fractionally, just enough for her to hear the trap in it. "Because it is my understanding that you are behind on the millwork payment from Gruber. A small thing, perhaps, but these small things accumulate." Belle kept her face completely still. She was not behind on the payment. She had made the first installment in July and the second was not due until October. She had her receipt. "I think you may have inaccurate information," she said. "I may," he said pleasantly. "I often deal in imperfect information. That is the nature of opportunity." He looked at the fence line. "You did build a fine fence," he said, and somehow in his mouth it was not a compliment but an inventory, as though he was pricing her improvements along with the land. "Good day, Mr. Fowler," Belle said. She did not open the gate. He left, still smiling, with his hired man behind him, and Belle went inside and pulled out her receipts and her paperwork and checked every line of every document 3 times and found everything exactly in order. But she knew a trap when she heard one being framed. The false information about Gruber's payment was a probe, testing whether she was uncertain enough about her own records to be unsettled by insinuation. She was not, but she was also not unaware that a man like Fowler did not make one visit if one visit did not work. She rode into town that afternoon and found Amos at the sheriff's office, a small spare room on the main street where he kept his records and occasionally slept on a cot when something required overnight presence. She told him about Fowler's visit with complete accuracy, including the false claim about the Gruber payment. Amos listened with his characteristic stillness, and then his jaw tightened once, which she had learned was his version of a strong reaction. "He is testing the water," Amos said. "He does this. He finds a weak point or invents one. If the claimant shows uncertainty or fear, he escalates. If they hold firm, he generally moves on to someone more vulnerable." "I held firm," Belle said, "but I want you to know in case it escalates anyway." "I am glad you told me," he said. He looked at her for a moment. "Belle, I want to say something carefully." She waited. "My interest in your situation is personal," he said, "meaning I care about what happens to you beyond my professional responsibility. I want you to know that, and I also want you to know that I will not let it cloud my judgment or overstep my authority. If Fowler violates the law, I will act on that as sheriff. If he operates in the gray area, the best defense is exactly what you are doing. Good records, visible improvement, and refusing to be destabilized." She looked at him. "I know that," she said. "I told you because I trust your judgment and your information, not because I need rescuing." "I know that too," he said, and the understanding between them was complete and did not require further discussion. Fowler came back 3 weeks later in October, this time without the hired man, and this time with a document he called a competing claim, suggesting that the original survey of her property boundaries had an error that placed part of her fence line on land that was technically under a separate filing. Belle looked at the document without touching it. "I will need to take this to the land office," she said. "Of course," Fowler said. "These things can drag through the legal process for some time, months. Meanwhile, you would be in an uncertain position about the eastern quarter of your property, which is where the best soil sits, as I understand it." "I understand that you intend this to be uncomfortable," Belle said, keeping her voice entirely level. "I also understand that legal processes have resolutions, and I am confident in my documentation." She went directly to Patterson at the land office, who examined the document Fowler had referenced and spent an hour with the original survey records, and found, definitively, that the competing claim was based on a survey that had been superseded and corrected 3 years prior. The boundaries of Belle's property were exactly what her deed said they were. Patterson wrote a letter to that effect. Belle had it in hand by mid-afternoon. She also spoke with Amos, who spoke with the county attorney, who wrote to Fowler with the legal clarity that such men responded to most reliably, the kind that had teeth and case numbers. Fowler sent no further representative to Belle's gate. The day after the resolution, Amos came by the property in the early evening with his good coat on and a look about him that she had not seen before, something less composed than his usual manner, something that had come partway to the surface and was waiting. "The Fowler matter is settled," he said. "I know," she said. "Thank you for your part in it." "I have something to say that is not about Fowler," he said. She waited. He stood at the gate, hat in his hand, the October light going amber and long behind him. He looked at her with the complete, undefended attention he had shown from the very first time he stopped on this road and called her work fine. "I have been careful all my life about trust," he said. "After Missouri, I was more careful still. I came here and I did my work and I kept everything close and I told myself that was wisdom." He paused. "I still believe it is wisdom to be careful. But I have also learned that there is a difference between careful and sealed, and that sealed is not the same as safe. It is just isolated." Belle held very still. "I love you," he said. "I did not arrive at it quickly or say it lightly. I have watched you work and listened to you think and seen what you have built here and who you are in the building of it. And I love you with a certainty I trust completely." The wind moved through the cottonwoods along the western edge. The meadowlark was still using that same post farther down the fence line, still making its argument to the evening. Belle looked at this man standing at her gate with his hat in his hand and his whole careful heart out in the open, and she felt the full weight of her own feeling for him, which she had been carrying for months with the same discipline she brought to every other difficult and necessary thing. "I love you," she said. "I have known it for some time. I was being careful, too." He stepped through the gate, the one she had built and he had helped make right, and he took her face in his hands with a tenderness so deliberate it felt like the most intentional thing she had ever witnessed, and he kissed her in the amber October light with the whole completed fence as witness. They were married in November in Caldwell at the small white church on the north edge of town, with Clara Hennessy and her husband Thomas in the front pew and Patterson from the land office in the third row, looking mildly less bored than usual, and Mrs. Cooper from the restaurant providing the wedding supper in the church hall afterward. Belle wore her best dress, which she had let out slightly at the waist because she had more muscle now than when it was made, and she carried a small bunch of late-season prairie wildflowers that Amos had found for her with the same thorough knowledge of the local land that he brought to everything. He stood at the altar in his dark coat without the badge, because this was a Saturday and they had agreed on that, and when she came down the short aisle and reached him, he took her hand with the same care he always used, as though the specific fact of her hand in his was something worth being present for. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Aldous, who was brief and sincere and knew better than to make the occasion longer than it needed to be. When it was done and Amos kissed her properly in front of the congregation, Clara Hennessy made a sound of genuine satisfaction, and Belle laughed into his shoulder, and the whole small church seemed to exhale a collective warmth that was the nearest thing to happiness a room full of people could manage together. They spent the first months of their marriage dividing their time between the farmhouse on the claim and the small house in town that the county provided for the sheriff. Amos had lived in the townhouse alone and kept it sparse, the way of a man who did not expect to need more. Belle looked at it with her practical eye and found the spaces that wanted warmth, and filled them gradually with the accumulated intelligence of someone who had learned to make much from available materials. The farmhouse she kept as a working property. There were decisions to be made about the spring planting and the longer question of what the land was best suited for, and she and Amos worked through those decisions together in the evenings, with the lamp between them and the maps and the soil notes he had been keeping. And the consultations had the quality of all their best conversations, two people who thought clearly and differently, and arrived together at something better than either would have reached alone. She wrote to Adeline in December and invited her to come for a visit in the spring. Adeline wrote back a long letter of the kind that could only be produced by someone who had been waiting with great patience for something to celebrate, and who was now deploying that patience as energy. She would come in April. She could not wait. She was so glad for Belle that she could not quite contain it in ordinary language and had resorted to underlining several words twice. Belle read the letter to Amos at the kitchen table. He listened to the whole thing with his coffee, and when she read the underlined parts, he made a small sound that was his version of laughing at something genuinely funny, and she loved him so much in that moment, it was almost more than she could accommodate. February brought the kind of cold that tested every structure a person had built, both the physical and the internal kind. The farmhouse held well, because Belle had chinked every gap and sealed every threshold with the same attention to detail she brought to fence posts. The townhouse held well too. Belle herself held well in the way of someone who had been tested before and knows what their actual limits are, which is different from not having limits. There was one night in February when the wind was genuinely alarming, driving ice against the windows with a sound like thrown gravel, when Amos lay awake beside her in the dark and she could feel the particular quality of his wakefulness, the kind that meant his mind was elsewhere. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I am thinking about the family I always thought I would have by now," he said quietly. "And the years I was too sealed, as I said, to begin one." She turned toward him. The dark was complete and the wind was loud. "We are beginning one," she said. "We are in the middle of it already." "I know," he said. "I am not complaining of the timing. I am only marking it." She put her hand on his chest, over his heart. "We have time," she said, "and what we are doing now is already the thing itself." He covered her hand with his. "Yes," he said. In March she found she was expecting a child. She sat with that knowledge for a day before she told him, not because she was uncertain about him, but because she wanted to know her own feelings about it completely before she brought another person into the experience. She found that her feelings were layered and clear and ultimately settled on a bedrock of joy that surprised her with its solidity. She had not been sure she had that available, given the years of difficulty. But there it was. She told him at the kitchen table over supper, directly, the way they told each other everything. He went very still for a moment, the way he did with things that mattered most. Then he stood up from the table and came to her, and held her with a gentleness that contained something she recognized as the specific warmth of a man who has been waiting for something without knowing it, and has now found it, and is afraid for 1 second that it will vanish before he can believe it is real. "It is real," she said into his shoulder. "I know," he said. "I am just taking it in." She laughed and he laughed, and they stayed like that for a long time with the lamp burning between the supper plates. Adeline arrived in April as promised, pulling into Caldwell on the stage with enough luggage to suggest she had not ruled out an extended visit, which turned out to be exactly what happened. She was 2 years older than Belle and had the same dark eyes and the same quality of stubborn capability. And she looked at Amos Keating with the measuring attention of a woman who loves her sister and has been worried about her for a long time. And she apparently found whatever she was looking for within the first hour, because her demeanor toward him shifted from carefully warm to genuinely warm with a speed that Belle recognized as Adeline's version of trust. She stayed 6 weeks. She helped Belle with the spring kitchen garden at the farmhouse, and walked the fence line and asked questions about the construction with the specific technical interest of someone who was quietly impressed and would admit it on her own terms. She and Amos had a long conversation one evening about Missouri and Kansas and the nature of land law in frontier territories, and Belle listened from the kitchen doorway with her hand on the doorframe, watching two people she loved reason through things together, and felt the particular satisfaction of a life that has room in it. The baby came in October in the 2nd year of their marriage, arriving in the autumn that Belle had come to think of as her true season, the time of year when she had completed the fence, when Amos had said those first 4 words, when everything had turned its direction. The baby came healthy and loud, with a full head of dark hair and a vigorous opinion about being in the world, and he was a boy. They named him James after Amos's father. Belle lay in the bed with James on her chest and Amos beside her, and outside the window of the townhouse the October wind was moving through the cottonwood tree they had planted in the yard that spring, and the light was the same amber gold as the day he had first told her he loved her. "He is extraordinary," Amos said, looking at his son. "He is extremely loud," Belle said, "which I also find extraordinary." "He has opinions," Amos said. "He comes by that honestly." She looked at him with all the love she had, which was considerable, and had continued to grow in the way of things that are well-rooted. "He does," she said. The farming claim continued to develop through those years, with the steady progress of something managed by people who made decisions thoughtfully and worked consistently. Belle rotated between kitchen garden vegetables for the household and sale, and a small grain crop that she and Amos worked together in the seasons when his sheriff's duties permitted. The cottonwood windbreak on the western edge grew tall enough to be genuinely useful within 3 years. The soil on the eastern quarter, the best soil that Fowler had correctly identified and tried to leverage against her, proved itself in the yield she took from it, steady and reliable. Amos served as sheriff of Caldwell through those years with the same quiet, thorough authority he had always brought to the work. The county grew, and the challenges grew with it. The complications of a frontier community finding its shape, the conflicts between cattle interests and farming interests, the questions of law enforcement in a territory where the law was still being written by the living of it. He handled those challenges with the judgment of a man who had been betrayed and come through it with his understanding of right action intact, which was more valuable than the original untested belief. He was, Belle thought often, the most genuinely honest person she had known. Not honest in the cold or self-righteous way, but honest in the way of someone who had learned what dishonesty cost and had decided the price was too high and the decision was complete. When he said something, it was true. When he made a commitment, it held. When he looked at her, it was with the whole of his attention. There was an evening 2 years after James was born when they were sitting on the porch of the farmhouse, which they used for weekend visits and work, and the summer dusk was laying its long light across the property, and James was asleep inside in the small bed they kept there for him, and the fence line was glowing in the golden hour. "I was thinking today about that first day," Belle said. "Which first day?" he asked. "The day you stopped," she said. "Every other rider had passed this fence without a word, and you stopped." He looked at the fence. "I remember." "What made you stop?" she asked. She had wondered and had not asked for 3 years. He was quiet in the thoughtful way. "I had ridden past the first day," he said. "You were working on the second section. I kept going. And then I spent the rest of that ride thinking about what I had seen. A woman alone doing real skilled work in difficult ground, and every man on that road treating it as invisible. And I thought about all the things that silence enables. I thought about Missouri and the silence that covered the lie there. I thought about what it costs to let things go unnamed." He looked at her. "So the next time I came down that road, I stopped. I looked at what you had built, and I told you what I saw." Belle felt the familiar quality of being known by him, which never became ordinary. "You said I had done fine work." "You had," he said. "You have." She reached across the arm of her chair and took his hand. He held it as he always did, with the careful, deliberate warmth that was entirely his. "I am glad you stopped," she said. "So am I," he said. "Every day." James learned to walk in the farmhouse kitchen, and learned to talk with the specific vocabulary of a child being raised by 2 parents who used language carefully and completely, and his early words were a source of considerable delight. He learned the word fence before he learned the word house, which Amos said was appropriate. He learned the word horse very early and with great feeling. He had Amos's eyes and Belle's stubbornness, and the particular combination was already, at age 2, suggesting a personality that would require both his parents' full attention for some years to come. By the time James was 3, the farmhouse had expanded by a room that Amos had built with the help of Thomas Hennessy over 2 autumn weekends, and the kitchen garden had been formalized into a proper layout with raised beds that corresponded exactly to the limestone map Amos had drawn for Belle on their first real conversation about the land. The cottonwood windbreak had become tall enough to cast real shade. The eastern quarter was in a rotation of wheat and kitchen vegetables that produced reliable surplus. Clara Hennessy had become a true friend, the kind that showed up in difficult times without requiring explanation, and told the truth when asked for an opinion. She was present when Belle's second pregnancy became apparent, and was the first person beyond Amos to know, and she received the information with the warm, no-drama practicality that made her company valuable in precisely that kind of moment. The second child was born in the spring, a girl they named Alice, and she arrived into a household that was ready for her and a brother who received her with the suspicious interest of a 3-year-old confronting a development that had not been cleared through him. He came around within a week. By the second week he was bringing her small objects of significance, a smooth stone, a cottonwood leaf, the tin hardware from Amos's saddlebag, which Amos quietly retrieved. Belle looked at her children and her husband and her land and her fence and the whole assembled evidence of the life she had built, and she thought, with a clarity that cut straight through everything else, that she had made something real here, that the thing she had put her hands to had held. Alice grew in the particular way of a second child who has a loud older sibling and learns to be strategic about getting what she needs, which involves a combination of timing and charm that Belle recognized as effective and Amos found occasionally alarming. She had Belle's dark eyes and Amos's capacity for quiet that could turn, in an instant, into decisive action. James, at 5, declared himself interested in horses with the finality of a person who has made a major life decision and is simply informing the relevant parties. Amos, who had more experience with horses than anyone else available, received this information with appropriate gravity and began an education that proceeded with the thoroughness he brought to all such projects. James learned the bay's name, which was Ramai, and the correct way to approach, and the vocabulary of basic horsemanship, and within a year was riding in front of Amos in the saddle with a look of pure intention on his face. The years found their rhythm. The land continued to produce. The community of Caldwell grew, and the Keatings were part of its fabric in the way of people who work consistently and keep their word and are known to be fair. Amos continued as sheriff. Belle continued to develop the farming operation and added a small egg-selling business with a flock of chickens that James fed with a seriousness that suggested he had appointed himself personally responsible for their welfare. Patterson at the land office retired and was replaced by a younger man who was less bored, which Belle noted as an improvement. The mill owner Gruber sold his business and moved back to Missouri. Mrs. Cooper retired from the restaurant and sold it to a young couple from Ohio, and the menu changed but remained decent. Adeline visited every year, sometimes twice, and had developed her own friendship with Clara Hennessy that functioned independently of Belle, which she found deeply satisfying, as if she had introduced two people who had been waiting to know each other. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Amos came home from the sheriff's office in the late afternoon with a small package wrapped in brown paper, and a look about him that was the look he got when he was carrying something important that he had thought through carefully. They sat on the porch of the townhouse after supper, with both children in bed inside, and the November evening was cold enough for a blanket across their laps but not so cold as to drive them indoors. He handed her the package. She opened it. Inside was a small framed photograph, sepia tone, that showed the farmhouse property from the south road. The fence was visible in the foreground, the full perimeter of it, the gate with its corrected hinge, the posts straight and the rails level. The cottonwood windbreak was visible in the background, grown tall. The farmhouse was in the middle distance, solid and enlarged from its original small footprint. The photograph had been taken on a clear day, and the light in it had the quality of something true. "I had it taken in September," he said, "when the morning light was right." Belle looked at the photograph for a long time. She looked at the fence she had built and the land she had held and the windbreak she had cultivated from volunteer seedlings and the house she had expanded and the whole assembled evidence of the life she had made real by refusing, at every point, to let silence stand for a verdict. "Every rider passed this fence without comment," she said quietly, "except you." "I was paying attention," he said. She looked at him. He was 46 now, and the years had added lines to his face that looked like evidence of everything he had been through, and she knew every line of his face the way she knew the fence line, completely and with full understanding of how it had been made. She loved him with the certainty of 5 years of accumulated specific truth. She loved him the way you love a thing that has proven itself in every kind of weather. "You were paying attention," she agreed, "and that changed everything." He put his arm around her under the blanket. The November stars were coming out over Caldwell, Kansas in the year 1884, enormous and certain above the town and the farmhouse property a mile south where the fence stood in the dark, solid as the day she had built it, and the cottonwood windbreak moved in the cold wind like the breathing of something alive and permanent. "Are you happy?" he asked. It was not a question he asked often. When he asked it, it was the real question. She considered it with the honesty he had always asked of her and that she had given him consistently, the full and unedited truth of her own experience. "Yes," she said, "not the simple kind, the kind that has weight to it, that knows what it cost. That is the only kind I trust," he said. "I know," she said. "That is one of the things I love about you." The wind moved through the cottonwood tree in the yard, the one they had planted the spring after they married, which was tall enough now to cast meaningful shade in summer, and whose roots were deep enough that it had come through 3 winters without faltering. James had fallen asleep under it in the summer. Alice had tried to climb it, which had produced a conversation about limits that Alice had received with the focused attention of someone cataloging information for later use. Inside the house, both children were breathing in their beds with the deep unconscious trust of children who have never known a night without warmth and safety, and Belle carried that fact as its own kind of evidence. Whatever she had built here was large enough to hold them. Whatever she had held on to when everyone else had suggested she let go had produced something real enough to live inside. Amos turned the photograph in his hands, looking at the fence line in the afternoon light of the image. "You did do fine work," he said. "I want to say it again, I will keep saying it." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I know," she said, "and I will keep hearing it." They sat on the porch under the blanket with the photograph between them and the stars coming fully out over the Kansas dark. And the wind was cold and clean, and the town was quiet around them. And the fence stood south of them in the night as it would stand through the winter and the thaw and the new growing season, and all the seasons after that, straight and solid, and telling the truth about a woman who had built it, and a man who had stopped to say so. And everything that had grown from those 4 words in the afternoon light of a summer day when everything in Belle Dalton's life had turned in the direction of its actual future. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the fine work of 2 people who had paid the price of difficult things and arrived together at the only kind of happiness worth the name, the kind that knows what it cost and holds it anyway, and does not let the silence stand for anything it should not. The stars over Caldwell were enormous, and the night was cold and clean, and the cottonwood breathed in the wind. And inside the house James and Alice slept in their beds with the deep trust of children who are held. And on the porch under the blanket Belle and Amos sat with the photograph between them and the full assembled truth of their life present and accounted for. And it was good. It was genuinely, solidly, completely good.